Wonderful good morning to all of you, and thanks for the invitation and sharing of a very complex set of requirements. I'm not a network god, so I'm an application person, and so if you ask very deep network questions, I will pass you on to my friend Youssef, who is not here, but he'll come back to you. But we will talk a lot about the set of challenges that you kind of pointed out, and since they are so big and so many, I can only scratch the surface to give you an idea of how we are tackling those. I'm very glad that my friend from Equinix pointed out that there's more to cloud than just Amazon and Azure. There's lots of Salesforce, there's lots of other players around. Even at Microsoft, while we run on the same network, the same data centers, and same technology sets, we have alone 5 or 6 different cloud assets that actually also need to be considered when you think about connectivity, security, training, and so forth. And so the portfolio that you think about is more than just a virtual machine and storage and so forth. And so the opportunity is big, but as you pointed out, the challenges are equally complex. One of our assets that we are working on very hard is to drive a consistent set of global presence. We'll talk a little bit about that so that you don't have to necessarily go out to various cloud providers. We will be in India, Japan, Africa, Middle East, wherever you need us to be. Our cloud assets, the ones that I showed you before, will be there. We're investing a heck of a lot of money and time and intelligence into trust. Because one of the key things that you're going to do if you trust Microsoft with your data is effectively trusting us. And we need to show to you that we're doing this. And then, of course, a key asset that we are investing in is protecting your investments that you already have made in on-premise systems with either VMware or Microsoft, and also continue to invest in hybrid technology, bringing you the Azure Microsoft investments into your data centers. So let's start with the trust environment. I'm not going to go through all of these, but at the end of the day, we are currently, I think, at 53 certifications that we're driving, ranging from global ones like ISO or SOX, to vertical ones like PCI, HIPAA, and so forth, to very specific ones in China, in the UK, for the US government, and so forth. And again, if you are looking at your own data centers, it's really hard to think through how you are going to support all of those certifications. That is part of what we're doing as part of our trusted cloud effort, and we continue to do that. If you see something that you say, oh, I would love to understand more, or you don't see something, talk to us, because we are looking for continuous markets where we can help with our compliance and certification efforts to make you successful. Again, the latest market that both Amazon and us are working on is financial services, which again, trying to move to regulatory workloads into the public cloud to really absorb the innovation and the capacity and flexibility of public cloud using in the financial services sector. A key element, of course, is that you need to be able to handle what the industry is investing in. As a Microsoft Azure environment, we will actually host whatever you throw at us, from operating systems to middlewares to databases and solutions. So we recently did a lot of work with our friends from Adobe. So the Adobe Cloud is now running on Azure. And you will see more partners like SAP and so forth running on the Azure environment in an integrated fashion so that you can effectively choose the investments you want to make, migrate or implement new, and mix and match the environments that you need to tackle. Which again was one of the key questions you asked is, so how do I deal with the flexibility requirements that I have, the investments that I make? And so part of what we're doing is effectively driving these investments into our cloud, partnering with the various vendors or ecosystems, and really bringing them natively into our environment. A key element of our strategy here is that we're moving into open standards very aggressively, and we are very much pushing into things like foundations. So we just joined the Linux Foundation. We have been part of the Hadoop Foundation for a long, long time, and so forth. And we, of course, have been working with people like SAP since 1994 and have been a very big part of the SAP ecosystem, among others as well. From a hybrid cloud perspective, we see, of course, that there are a number of dimensions to think about. These are the 4 that I have picked out as an element of how you deal with them. And what are key elements that you asked? So from how do you move to a DevOps model, unified deployment? How do you think about management and security? Identity, a key question that was already asked a number of times. And then, of course, the data platform. Since the slides are not that big, I can't put everything on there, but think about these 4 assets where we are moving into a consistent model of deploying Azure and giving you the same Azure technology in Azure Stack, which is, again, a partner-based model with HP, Dell, Lenovo, and so forth, to take Azure and run it into your own data centers in terms of the technology. And having a single management, integrated security system, integrated operations model between public cloud and your private cloud or a provider cloud. It doesn't matter which one you do. Management security we'll talk a little bit more about because I don't believe those are really important assets that you need to think about. Identity, Microsoft Active Directory has been an enterprise staple since a long, long time. And we've extended the Active Directory capabilities into numerous areas that I will show on a very fascinating slide that I found, which shows the entire ecosystem, which integrates multiple clouds from Salesforce to Workday to Amazon to Google, as well as dealing with complex B2B and B2C integrations. And then last but not least, of course, data services. We're putting here our friend SQL Server out there, which is our database. But of course, we support MySQL, Postgres, Oracle, DB2 in a similar fashion in the Microsoft Azure environment. Let's start with Azure Stack. On the Azure public side, I'm sure some of you have explored it already and are using it. We are now getting ready to release Azure Stack in partnership with our partners like Dell and HP and so forth. And we effectively took a lot of the technologies, including the software-defined networking elements, load balancing, and so forth, and worked with our partners to provide an appliance model, and then put the Azure software solution capabilities, the portal, provisioning technology, various services from compute, storage, and network, and so forth, and put that into a box that allows you to simply go and talk to your hardware provider, and you get an Azure cloud into your data center. And then there's automatic integration options from networking through security, through marketplaces that allow you to go and develop solutions one way and then choose the deployment targets. If it's on-premise in your data center or in a public data center in Microsoft Azure, the solution is the same, the security is the same, the operations model is the same, and you can effectively just pick your target where you want to deploy it. There's no change and no break in the system, which you normally have between, let's say, VMware and Azure or VMware and Amazon and so forth. It's the same technology running in your environment. I told you that this would be a more complicated slide, but it covers the interesting aspects that Azure Active Directory as our identity management system covers. It covers the integration into the enterprise, which is where we started. Then we integrated B2C providers, Google Identity, Facebook Identity. If you're in China, we support WeChat and other identities. And so you can effectively take consumer identity securely into your enterprise and grant permissions based upon an identified. You can enforce multi-factor authentication on all of these technologies and so forth. The next step is B2 services. We have about 2,800 services that we have integrated into Azure Active Directory that allows you as an IT person to manage and control the identity and access to things like Salesforce, Workday, Amazon, et cetera, from one Active Directory environment. So a single identity that manages the entire access spectrum. And then last but not least, we're automating B2B access. So if you as a company partner with another company, you don't have to necessarily import the employees into your directory. You just grant access to the partner, and you effectively can map identity into your group structures and give access and security control based upon that. So think of Azure Active Directory as a spine of identity that has a lot of tentacles that can integrate across various spectrums, across clouds, across your on-premise systems, and across customer or consumer systems all up. Again, a single spine, and then using open protocols, so OAuth and so forth, that enable you as a developer to not worry about is it Active Directory or is it something else. You write the code once, and the system effectively takes care of your authentication in a secure fashion. Security, many comments already made. From our perspective, security is paramount. It's kind of the other half of trust. We have the compliance efforts to establish trust and transparency, and we're driving security not only into the physical side and into the software side, but also across a number of dimensions. One is passive, meaning deploying firewalls and deploying whatever technology is out there to protect and harden the system as it is, and then we're deploying intelligence. So AI-based machine learning systems that effectively detect anomalies based upon various access patterns. It depends on user access patterns, so active threat analytics, for example, or it can do network pattern analysis to determine if there's an attack going on, and we will effectively share with you that an attack has happened, or we see, oh, there's a banking customer that's being attacked. Let's see if there are other patterns that point to a similar direction where another banking customer might be affected, and so forth. So we will look for patterns aggressively and actively and proactively work with you to determine how to defend best against those things. Another question that was raised in your requirements ask was, okay, you're doing all this eventing and monitoring and all this stuff, and I tell you, we are writing a lot of eventing and telemetry into our systems. I think the last count was in the hundreds of petabytes per day in terms of writing eventing and monitoring information into telemetry systems. However, we are opening that telemetry up in two forms. One is you can access custom code through REST APIs, storage, eventing, and do whatever you would like to do. If you're a smaller shop and you don't have the investments made yet, you can either pick it up and write a little piece of code yourself, or we have designed standard integration into things like Splunk, ArcSight, and common enterprise tools that effectively enable you to say, I would like to take that Azure telemetry and move it into my Splunk environment so that I can integrate it. So you can just download these connectors and write the necessary, wire the security up, and you can effectively use them. This slide says preview, where you just released them, I think 4 or 5 weeks ago. And again, so think telemetry schemas, custom access, and then defined integration into common enterprise systems. And again, if there is one that you don't like, one that we don't have on the system, tell us, and we will see what we can do either with the vendor or we share with you design patterns of how to write one of those, because it's not that hard. The other piece that we thought might be really important to invest in is management. So once you have deployed a cloud and you're running your VMware environment on premise today, how do you manage it consistently? So we have invested in a technology called Operations Management Suite that effectively deals with these 4 pillars of ranging from insights to configuration management and protection, recovery, and so forth. And we do that across any cloud. So it's either on-premise, Windows Server, or VMware. It is AWS or Azure at this point in time, and of course Azure Stack. So at least from this perspective, you can look at management, monitoring, patching, updating, configuration, and so forth in a consistent fashion, not just in Azure, but also with AWS, VMware, and Windows Server Hyper-V. And then connectivity. This is a very high-level slide for people that are deep in the networking business, obviously. But I thought it still is important to kind of show how we think about the problem in a conceptual fashion. One of them is internet connectivity. So if you have consumers that need access to your services, obviously you drive that through the internet using HTTPS and other protocols to open the connectivity up. Then you do point-to-site connectivity, site-to-site, and eventually you might get up to ExpressRoute, where our partners Equinix or Verizon, AT&T, and so forth effectively enable you to take dedicated connection between your data center and the Microsoft network. I really love the point that the Equinix person made, that all the cloud providers are effectively big networks providers. As far as I know, roughly we manage and control 1.5 million miles of fiber around the globe as Microsoft. Some of it is our own dark fiber from the West Coast to the East Coast, for example. We run our own dark fiber. We just invested with Facebook into a cable to Europe. We are investing in cables to the South America because we believe that connectivity is one of those that needs to happen very fast, and there's innovation that investments from people like Facebook, Microsoft, and others can drive significant ease of use and speeds that help us in terms of adopting this. I always tell this joke. Anybody here from Sun Microsystems? I love the Sun Microsystems slogan where in the late 90s they said something like, the network is the computer. That was their advertising. And I always say, you know, they were right, but they were too early and they didn't think big enough. So when you think about cloud, it's really about a worldwide spanning center of compute capability, but of course connected with a network. And so for me, cloud computing is very much network computing, and therefore having this set of options is very important. We recently announced a whole bunch of interesting network technology. One of them is, for example, our layer 3 switch, which we call the Sonic switch. And that Sonic switch is open sourced. It's part of the Open Compute Platform project. And again, our colleague from Equinix kind of mentioned it already. And it's an interesting combination between used patterns like APIs, abstractions, and containers. So if you haven't looked it up, look for the Microsoft Sonic switch. It really is an interesting design of how we move to software-defined networking at layer 3 with our own software, but partnering with people like Mellanox and others to provide the network capability and intelligence. And so that's something where you can compose these four with our layer 3 switching network and drive it from there. The other piece that I thought might be useful to think about is how do you really build applications? So lift and shift is one thing, meaning moving existing software and moving it over to the cloud. I think lots of people have experience. I have some slides to talk about what we recommend people think about there. But the cool thing that we have now seen as the industry is we're moving from on-premises software that had a lot of variety and very little common ground to IIS, again, where we established what is a network, what is a compute, and what is storage. Because before that, it was kind of agreed upon, it wasn't really clear, and you had lots of variety. PaaS is where the next battleground is today, where a lot of definition still happens, and I'll show you some of the investments we are making. And then the next ground is serverless or Lambda, depending on which camp you belong into. The Azure folks and the Google folks call it Azure or functions. The Amazon folks call it Lambda, but it's roughly the same idea of how you take code and not think about it. You just deploy the code and you don't think about infrastructure. You wire it up and it executes when it needs to execute. From our perspective, the solution ecosystem will never be a single vendor. It's not going to happen. It never has, and I don't think will ever be. So therefore, we are investing in partnerships in a lot of areas. One of them is ecosystems. So I think Docker containers and our Docker partnership, the Mesos DCOS partnerships, and Kubernetes as an open source conversion of how you think about modern application development, DevOps, and containers, and so forth. But there are other people like our Cloud Foundry friends, SAP, who are a significant force in the enterprise, which are, of course, going to be hosted and addressed by Microsoft in partnership with those to host them. So Cloud Foundry has been GA'd since over 8 or 9 months on Azure, so you can deploy Pivotal Cloud Foundry and other Cloud Foundry assets in Azure, and there's tight integration both into monitoring, security, and diagnostics from Cloud Foundry into the Azure ecosystem. But of course, there's a new ecosystem coming up. Blockchain is the example I picked. And so we have partnered very closely with Ethereum and other open source providers on the blockchain side to really help you building these new types of applications. And this will continue. We will continue looking where is either the industry going, where do we think we want to go with Azure Service Fabric, for example. The name is unfortunate because the Azure Service Fabric can actually run on Amazon. It can run on physical kit. It can run on VMware or Hyper-V. It makes no difference because it is an abstracted solution that just needs compute power. and a network to effectively execute containers or other application environments. From a serverless application perspective, we think about this in 3 areas. One, a platform. How do you think about the platform? There's the execution side, which is the functions itself, and then there's higher level wiring, which we call logic apps. So how do you design a flow of applications that are composed of functions? Our suggestion is to start thinking about logic apps, which is a workflow-like environment with persistence and other things that you might be expecting from workflows, and then connecting it into a wide ecosystem, hundreds of these things, connecting into, say, Salesforce, Office 365, and so forth. And then, of course, provide rich support through Visual Studio on the one side, but also Eclipse and other areas where people go in order to write their code, Xcode and so forth. And so you will see us supporting all of these environments, depending on which environment you would like or prefer. The other aspect you asked us to talk about is cloud migration. And I'm using the Microsoft IT example because we had an IT that started on-premise. We are a 40-year-old company after all. And while we have an advantage of a homogeneous environment, pretty much Windows, we are a very, very large SAP shop, for example. And so our IT friends, they didn't really have a choice to go to the cloud or not. They were effectively told, this is your opportunity to shine, figure it out. And they came up with a pretty good plan of saying, okay, how do I drive this from a hybrid architecture, moving on-premise stuff over to the cloud? What is my strategy? Where do I go? And they came up in the end with this tunnel or this funnel where they go and say, okay, retire it, right size, eliminate environments. That's the easiest way of doing things. If you don't have to migrate, it's perfect. But then, of course, you think about how do I take a capability or a solution scenario and move it to SaaS, which is where most of our assets are actually going from an IT perspective. And then if we can't do that, do we want to keep the solution? Do we want to reinvigorate it? So move it to PaaS, rebuild it, redesign it, optimize it. And if that doesn't happen, use Azure IaaS and just deploy as is and operate as you want to go. And ideally, the percentage gets lower the deeper you go into the funnel. And again, Microsoft IT, of course, uses a lot of Microsoft stuff. In this example, they didn't show the SAP scenarios, but we use Contour, we use Talent Source, and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of non-Microsoft clouds that we're actually integrating into this environment as well. Then there are a lot of guidance tools for you. So this is just the Microsoft side, obviously. Keep looking at the documentation. One of the things that I think a lot of people are not really aware of, documentation is like code. It changes every day, sometimes multiple times a day, and we're adding new capabilities all the time. So you can't just say, I read it once, and now it's forever this way. Keep looking at it if you have questions or if you see something that you want to find out. There are specific investments in architecture, reference architecture, guidance patterns, and so forth. And then this is just example tools that you can run inside your data center that will do a collection of what's going on. There are agent and agentless systems, which effectively give you a warehouse of information about your applications and your data center, which starts with simple things like, is this virtualizable if it's not yet virtualized? Okay, can you do that? It then says, actually, based upon the usage patterns I'm seeing, let's say it uses an 8 CPU system on premise. Actually, I only need 2 virtual CPUs, and I'm using a DV2 to use a Microsoft Azure virtual machine, and so forth. And it effectively will tell you how to move it, what to do it, how to right size it, and so forth in nice little graphics. Again, these are the tools that we have been using with customers around the globe very successfully. And so don't go and just migrate stuff. Have a plan, like our IT friends shown, and then use tools to help you with the migration itself and really understand how you want to drive it forward. And understand that it's not just Azure or AWS. You will think about Office 365 or Salesforce or Workday and others and bring that into a consistent strategy alongside Azure and AWS and so forth. Last but not least, just a little picture of how we think about servicing you. So data centers for us means at least 2 or more, which we call a region. We have 38 right now out deployed across the globe with our own network connecting them. Then with Azure Stack, we enable service providers to provide you with Azure services. And again, we're working with hundreds of those. And then, of course, we are working with enterprise customers like yourself to enable Azure capabilities that allow you to effectively create this mesh of capabilities that run where they need to run. In our data centers, in partner data centers, or in your data center, but consistent from a capability perspective, security, and operations. With that, I'm done talking about Azure for now. I'm not sure I'm pretty good on time, I think. I have my helper that gives me clues.
You have 5 minutes.
Good.
Thanks, Uli. So we have mics on both sides.
Yep.
First question. Well, I'll start, actually, while we get these around. Would you partition what you went through into what applies to Azure in public and private versus what applies to clouds beyond Azure in public and private? Is there a simple breakdown of that?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of areas that only apply to Azure. Again, the Docker containers or the ecosystems like SAP and so forth. But a lot of the migration guidance and so forth apply to pretty much anything because one of the key things that we have made as Microsoft IT, for example, is moving to SaaS as much as we can. So we don't want to keep all this old stuff. We want to move it to Dynamics or Office 365 or SAP services like Concur and others.
Okay.
I think you just touched on this, and if you said this before, my apologies, but how much of Microsoft is actually run on Microsoft Azure?
So from a server percentage, it's 60% right now from a server count of the old count, but it's 85% of the applications
85%.
from Microsoft IT. So if you need to really think, Microsoft is the engineering company, and then Microsoft IT is the backend company that supports the engineering business. So the rest of Microsoft runs on Azure. So Office 365 and so forth run on Azure. Microsoft IT has a bit of footprint left on-premise, and they're moving it onto the cloud. So SAP, for example, is still mostly on-premise. It's not all of it on-premise, but mostly. So I think 60% server count, 85% application count.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. So last year I attended at RSA a very, very good session by one of your engineers on the security side of Azure, and truly, I mean, you guys are doing impressive work there. Couple of comments, though, based on your presentation and some of the stuff I've seen last year was, while you guys are protecting your own infrastructure very thoroughly, and you've done an amazing job getting where you guys are getting, I haven't seen the same concern about, even though you've mentioned that you're exposing some of the stuff nowadays, I really haven't seen that exposed in the stack in the same way. That's the first thing. The second thing is that by providing your stack on-prem, it eased the consumption model, but it also hides a number of details that from a security perspective, connectivity perspective, all of a sudden we have to trust you because you're the proxy sitting on-prem, and now at that point we're onboarding the cloud from that point on, and that means that whatever controls I would have liked to have inside of the cloud for my data, for my transport, all of a sudden that's kind of blocked right there at the stack, right? And the third aspect of that is the mobility piece. I mean, today, .NET and everything else might be a great solution for me. What if in, I don't know, 2 years' time, things are changing and I need to move stuff out of it to go elsewhere, or it morphs, right?
Yep. So let me address a couple of these comments. So first of all, if I understood you right, the first question was around how do we expose our security capabilities in your solution space, which we are doing through encryption, identity management, various controls that you have access to. That would be in the public Azure cloud, how you run in the virtual namespace, let's call it that. So one of the efforts I'm driving is an effort called Virtual Data Center, that actually allows you to set up virtual DMZs if you want to, or DMZs, depending on where you come from, and effectively set up a namespace that's completely controlled traffic-wise, security-wise, encryption-wise, based upon controls you entirely have under control. Azure Stack is, again, two pieces. You have the underneath the hypervisor, to keep it simple, which is a closed system, because we are not allowing you to introduce antivirus on your own and stuff like that. But what we are doing is we actually are opening up the architecture and we certifying the Azure Stack, meaning the capabilities underneath the hypervisor will run through ISO certification, and we will give you a report of what's in it and what are we doing. In terms of interconnect between Azure Stack and Azure, you are in complete control how this works. We will have default recommendations of how you connect, but you effectively have to think of Azure Stack as a cloud, and you own the interconnect between Azure Stack and Azure Public. So there is no default that we are kind of silently connecting. You have to actually build a gateway. We have gateway technology built in, but you are the ones that have to configure it and set it up in order to make the connection happening, and you control it completely. And so that's these two areas. And the third area, what was that again? Sorry. Application portability. So I always think about cloud computing as these two things. One, you have a hosting relationship, and then you have a technology relationship. The hosting relationship we already weaken in the sense of Azure Stack allows you to take the Azure capabilities and run it at Rackspace or Equinix or in your own data center. So that's already a very good way of loosening the hosting relationship. If you then look at the code you write, if it's .NET or Java or whatever, if you run an operating system like Windows or Linux, you can take it and run it on top of Amazon if you wanted to, or Azure. It makes actually no difference. The complexity comes in when you think about security, provisioning, and all this other stuff. And there we are saying we will support things like Terraform, as well as other efforts in this area to create a cloud-neutral provisioning model. We, of course, recommend or would like you to think about Azure Stack and Azure as a way of dealing with that. And then we will work with people like you to figure out what else we can do to make this more transparent. The code is portable. That's not the issue. If you use standard APIs, so one of the things I've seen a couple of people do is they talk to me about a Hadoop strategy, then they pick up specific capabilities that are not in the Hadoop foundation, but are provided by a specific vendor, and that makes sense because of a business requirement, then all of a sudden you don't have a Hadoop strategy anymore. That's the risk you run if you're not very, very careful. And so part of this is think through what the code architecture is. I think that's fairly straightforward. With containers, it gets even better. We just announced Linux Hyper-V containers, so you can run them also on a Windows operating system if you run a Windows data center, and of course Windows containers anyway. With the databases, I think we have a pretty good standard with ODBC and SQL and so forth. But again, if you use Oracle specifics or SQL Server specifics, you're stuck in terms of the technology. You can still move the application, but you're stuck with the technology, which might or might not be okay. So I look at it as the application side is not hard. Security, operations, those things are harder, but also addressable. Again, Azure Stack is one option. Open source things like Terraform and others is another option.
So we do need to be wrapping up. Yep. So we'll
Wrapping
stop
up
there. Okay. Thanks, Uli. One more? Okay.
One more.
It's really quick. So when you said ISO certification, are you specifically also tackling common criteria and enhanced assurance levels so that from a security perspective, you give that, is that common criteria part of the scope of your ISO certification?
Yes. So if you go back to the trusted slide, you actually see on the top row, we have a Common Security Alliance certifications. So we are a member, and we're clearly going against those certifications. So ISO SOX and C-Star is effectively what we are investing in at that level, and then you go into verticals and country-specific ones. Okay?
All right.
Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and I'll be back, I guess, at some point. Thank you.